an interview with William C. Rempel. Hello everyone, this is Hayato Uesugi, a Japanese editor, translator, writer, and English and translation lecturer in Tokyo. With me online today is one and only William C. Rempel, the author of The Gambler, How Penniless Dropout, Kerkorian became the greatest dealmaker in capitalist history. That national bestseller, which was highly acclaimed by the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Seattle Book Review, and other media, is finally being released in Japan. Hello, Bill. You never planned to write a biography of Kerkorian. As you mentioned in a note to readers, you have never met Kerkorian, and you soon found that the information about him was so limited. His privacy should be protected, even beyond the grave. Why did you decide to write his biography, although you had a lot of hindrances?
Well, the fact is, I didn't decide to write it. It was offered to me by an editor at HarperCollins who read the New York Times obituary and found that he was this person she'd never heard of was a self-made billionaire who was, as a teenager, he was a boxing champion. He was a daredevil airplane aviator. He built modern Las Vegas. He built the three biggest hotels in the world over the period of years. He owned and bought and sold MGM Studios 3 times, each time making another fortune. He was a controlling interest in each of the 3 American car makers, big ones, Chrysler, Ford, and Chevrolet, and General Motors. And this was somebody who was such a prominent man in American business, and yet this editor, who was well-read and well-informed at HarperCollins, had never heard of him. And she said, well, how can this be? Somebody so fascinating could be so unknown. So she contacted me to see if I knew about him and if I would be interested in finding more about him. And that's how I started. That's how I became the biographer of Kerkorian, the man no one knew. But you see, understand that Kirk was unknown on purpose. He was, by design, a private man. He had no public relations division. He had no publicist. And in fact, his lawyers and business associates were all in the business of keeping him so private that he could be comfortable in his own world. When he is this billionaire, prominent businessman, would walk the streets of Beverly Hills without an entourage, no bodyguard, no swarm of friends and hangers on. He drove his own car. It was usually a simple Ford or a Jeep. So he was very different from the business people who thrive on celebrity themselves. He was no Donald Trump, for instance.
What most attracted you with Kerkorian? Please tell us about his personal magnetism.
Well, Kirk had very little personal magnetism. In fact, he toned himself down to the point that he was almost invisible in a crowd. He was very shy. He was reticent he never wanted to be the center of attention. If he was in some big public event, you'd more likely find him in a corner somewhere sipping a drink, trying to stay out of the limelight. So that wasn't what attracted me to him. It was his success. It was his sense of his comfort with risk was incredible. And so learning a little bit about where that came from, how that evolved was a big challenge and part of the story. And so, as a journalist, I was intrigued, and the fact that people didn't want me the fact that there were people from Kerkorian's world that didn't want this book. They were concerned that he would not have approved, that his privacy was so important that, as you mentioned, they wanted his anonymity to go to the grave with him. But to me, his story was so important, so revealing, so downright exciting, that I wanted to tell his story. I didn't want his legacy and his life to be lost to history. And so as a journalist who often wrote stories that people didn't want to have published, I guess I felt a little bit like the matador waving the red flag was like the bull getting the red flag waving in front of him. So I went after it, and that was the challenge.
As for the writing The Gambler, I believe that you were strongly influenced by Dial Torgerson, your late colleague at the Los Angeles Times. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, sure. First of all, Dial Torgerson was a business writer at first at the LA Times, where I was also worked for 36 years. And he discovered Kerkorian as a business writer, covering his early days. And well before Kirk became a billionaire, Dial was already interested in the fortune that he was acquiring in aviation and other fields. But Dial had the advantage that I did not of getting to talk to Kerkorian's family and friends, because by the time I came along, they were all dead. Kirk lived to 98. He outlived everybody in his early days, classmates, schoolmates, early partners, and all of his family. Pretty much were passed before he died, and he died at 98, and that's when I entered the picture. So Dial's book, which he wrote in 1973, came out in 73, had very early stories about Kirk that I had no access to, and so his version of Kirk's early days are very important in my work in doing this story. I used a lot of Dial's early interviews, and Dial was a very important journalist at the LA Times. Later, he became a foreign correspondent, and unfortunately, he was killed in action as covering the civil wars in Central America in the early 1980s. And he was killed on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, a loss to his family and friends and to journalism.
I'm afraid Kerkorian became better known in general after the sensational relationship with Lisa Bonder, his third wife, was disclosed. Although Kirk was one of the most established business people in the States, most people now remember him not as an admirable billionaire, but as an unfortunate guy who was suffering from big trouble with a greedy lady. What do you feel about the fact that only his scandalous side is emphasized?
Well, it's not the only thing emphasized in The Gambler. Kirk didn't even see that as a scandal, frankly. His problem with that era, that story, that woman, was that his privacy was compromised. He was hauled into court in a public way. It made the tabloids and the scandal sheets of the era. But he did nothing scandalous except the woman that claimed that Kirk was the father of her baby, and tried to hold him up for huge amounts of money for that. It wasn't his baby. It was, but Kirk, even though he offered to take care of this child, even though it wasn't his, and he did, provide for her in his will and in a contract, set up a trust fund for her. She grew up to be a very wealthy woman, young woman, but Kirk, for his part, always regarded this episode of his life as a disappointment, not a scandal. It was a disappointment because he was so exposed to the public. Details of his financial life, details of his personal life, all were hauled into a courtroom and exposed and covered by both the tabloids and the legitimate press, to the point that he felt violated. And so I'm sure that in life that was his biggest disappointment, but not because it was a scandal, but because it was a violation of his personal space.
You sometimes compare Kerkorian to Donald Trump in this publication. What is the difference between them? And do you think there was a possibility that Kerkorian could have become the president of the United States? If so, what kind of country would the United States have been?
Well, it would have been a much nicer White House, but there's no way that Kirk would ever run for president, ever, because he hated politics and was terrified of public speaking, so and shy at that. But there are so many ways that they're different. They're polar opposites, and you can see it. The world can see the difference right away, because there is a name Trump on every building that Trump has ever been involved in, every project, he's on hotels, he's on casinos, his name is on stakes and universities and all sorts of things. Kirk put his name on nothing. He was the owner of MGM Studios, and he did not put his name on his parking spot. But there are so many ways. When it comes to their wealth, Donald Trump is a boaster. He faked his way onto a Forbes list one year. Kirk never talks about his wealth. He doesn't participate personally in any interviews about his wealth. Even the Forbes people can't talk to him. And then there's the bankruptcies. Kirk has never flushed out a debt by declaring bankruptcy. Donald Trump has done 5, 6, 7, I don't know how, maybe 9 different bankruptcies. So they're very different there. But I think one place where they're particularly different is that in the White House, Trump has been very demanding of loyalty. He's fired a lot of people who he considered having insufficient loyalty to him. In the case of Kerkorian, I was asking some of his people specifically about that, about why people stay with him so long. He has so many loyal top executives, and one of them explained. He said, Kirk takes all the risks, but he shares all the credit. And when times are good, times are bad, it's always the same. He takes the risk and shares the credit. And what that does, it inspires loyalty. So Kirk doesn't demand loyalty, he inspires it. And that's a big difference.
Please let us know what was the most enjoyable for you and what was the most challenging for you in writing The Gambler.
Well, just getting to know this fascinating man was a treat. I didn't know him either, same as my editor. So this was an opportunity to get to know one of the captains of industry who had been so overlooked, and to share his legacy with the country.
The Gambler is a tremendously enjoyable book. For me, it is Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or Thomas Walpole's You Can't Go Home Again. I believe many readers would like to keep on reading it, and I wanted to keep on translating this book. Thus, many of us want to say, Kirk, please stay alive. My question is that if he was still alive now, what kind of other great achievements would he make?
Well, the fact is, Kirk did a very good job of staying alive for a long time. He went 98 years and kept very busy right up to the end. And furthermore, his legacy didn't die when he went when he died. He continued to give generously as a philanthropist, and he gave $1 billion or more during his life, and more than that after in his passing. So to this day, Kirk is helping to improve the world with his legacy, with his generosity, and his wealth at the end was all given to charity. So medical research, scientific inquiry, all sorts of things are being aided to this moment by Kirk's legacy.
You are an established journalist and non-fiction writer who has published great books like this The Gambler, as well as At the Devil's Table, the untold story of the insider who brought down the cartel. You are one of the most prolific authors in the States. Just like Kerkorian, I believe you are very energetic and have a lot of ideas. Could you let us know about your current project?
Well, I do have a lot of ideas, and that's all they are right now. I have lots of projects underway, but none of them far enough that I can talk about yet. I look forward to sharing them with you later.
I know you have a strong family unit around you. Your wife, Barbara Hyde Pierce, is an award-winning television news producer who worked with CBS. Your brother, Carl Rempel, a supercomputer technician, strongly supports you and made a fantastic website for you. And your kids, Jason, Lara, and Emma, make their dad feel richer than any other billionaire. Could you tell me about them?
Well, like Kirk, I value most my family, and like Kirk, they're my cheerleaders, they're my fact checkers, and Kirk had Kirk's sister who lived to be 102, and was with him to the his last days almost, was also a very important member of his team. She's the one that could tell him the truth no matter how hard it was to take. And I enjoyed learning more about her in the course of looking into Kirk, because she was such a force of nature.
I was very happy to be able to translate and include your original essay, Kerkorian's 7 Secrets to Success for Japanese Readers. Thank you very much. Could you add a little bit more information about it for them?
Well, Kirk, the last thing Kirk would ever do was say he was an expert about something. The last thing he would do would say, I know the secrets of success. Not 1, not 7, not any number. He would never claim to be an authority on anything. He was that kind of modest man. But if you study him, as I have, and as a biographer, I was able to look into his life in a way that allowed us to say, well, here are some examples of things that he did that made a big difference in his success. And like I mentioned before, the loyalty that he generated with his aides and partners what came from his integrity and his generosity of spirit. And those things are universal. They're not American or Japanese or Armenian or anything. They're the human values. And I collected those and I've put them down in the for your sharing with the Japanese audience. And I think it's such a great window into the character and power of a man of such a small unknown person to be so such an inspiration. I'm glad you get to see them. I'm glad he wasn't here to object, because he would definitely object to anyone putting in his mouth things that made it look like he was boasting. He would be quite unwilling to do that.
Although we are now in a very difficult situation after the outbreak of COVID-19, if Kerkorian was still alive, what do you think he would try to do for people in the States and all over the world?
Well, Kerkorian was a man who really hated to see suffering. He wanted to help in any way he could. In 1988, the Armenian nation, Soviet Armenia then, was hit by a devastating earthquake that killed a couple 100,000 people, left the country in shambles physically, and so what Kirk did was remarkable. He created an airlift of relief supplies, food, and building materials, medicine, and started an airlift that went on after the earthquake for 20 years. So it was an airlift of the magnitude of the Berlin airlift back in the 1940s. But in this case, it was completely financed by Kerkorian and Armenian charity groups, and Kirk's contribution was the airplanes and the steady supply. So I think if he was, it's not just if he was here today. The fact is, like I mentioned earlier, his wealth continues to be in the service through charities of efforts to improve medical care and scientific research. So chances are pretty good that some of the billions that Kirk left behind are to this day being used to perhaps solve and cure the COVID-19. So Kirk's still with us in a very positive way.
Finally, please give us your message to Japanese readers.
Well, I'm hoping, just hoping that you enjoy getting to know Kerkorian as much as I enjoyed sharing his story with the world, and I'm honored and pleased that Kirk's story and his legacy will be part of Japanese literature from this day on. So thank you for this opportunity, and it's been a pleasure.
I can't conclude this interview without showing my appreciation for you sparing your precious time with me for this interview. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to talk with you and to introduce a great author to the Japanese audience. Thank you very much, Bill.